Political realities just kind of suck. I mean, we'd all like to just believe that a mass uprising is on its way and it will sweep every opponent from our path. Birds will sing, the sun will shine, and presto, every progressive idea will become the law of the land within, say, a month. But a point I keep making to my progressive friends is that we also have to be very honest about certain facts, as in, all good ideas will die in the United States Senate if Mitch McConnell is the majority leader, and they may meet a similar fate if Democrats win the Senate majority in 2020 with, say, a 52 to 48 margin, which is about as optimistic a number you could honestly come up with. Because that majority, a Democratic majority of 52 members, would include people like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who has no interest in supporting Medicare for all or free college tuition. Which is why the race to defeat John Cornyn in Texas is not only important in terms of the overall number, but it's important in terms of which Democrat ends up facing Cornyn and hopefully becoming a U.S. Senator. There are plenty of centrist Democratic candidates running in the primary, which will be held March 3rd, but one candidate is actually solidly progressive. Cristina Tzintzun Ramirez. In her 20s, Cristina was a founder of the Workers' Defense Project, whose mission was to make sure workers, especially Hispanic workers, had basic rights and were safe on the job, protecting them from the typical dangerous conditions that millions of workers, especially immigrant workers, face because corporations don't care. In fact, as an aside, though especially relevant to the work Cristina has done, the National Council for Occupational Safety and Health, that's National COSH, just noted in a study that we're going to talk about on this podcast in an upcoming episode that there has been a spike in the number of deaths and injuries in the workplace. And I'm quoting from that study, communities of color continue to pay a high price for the failure of their employers to implement safe workplace practices. Workplace fatalities among African American workers increased by 16% in 2018, while deaths among Latinx workers were up 6%. And that's the end of that quote. Now, Cristina left the Workers' Defense Project in 2015 to form an organization called JOLT, which is aiming at mobilizing young Hispanic voters. And Cristina now joins me to talk about her campaign. You've done some really incredible progressive work over many years, Cristina. And first of all, you co-founded the Workers' Defense Project, which was a great advocate and is still a great advocate for working families to make sure that they have good, safe jobs. And you also, after the 2016 election, started something called JOLT, J-O-L-T. And that's where I kind of want to start our conversation. And the purpose of JOLT was to essentially get young Latino voters registered and then mobilize them to vote. And this leads me to the following question and a musing that I had as I was thinking about our conversation. There's been a lot of talk about Texas changing from a red state to a purple state or a blue state. In other words, becoming more progressive, more quote unquote democratic. And I wonder, and I think this is probably true about lots of places, not just Texas, but is it a fact? And do you think that actually Democrats will grow and more people will be drawn to the Democratic Party if we, in fact, have more progressive candidates like yourself? And that is, if you have people that are going against someone like John Cornyn, who are centrist and corporate Democrats, that's not going to excite people, right?
Yeah, in Texas for the last 20 years previous to Beto O'Rourke running, the way people ran in this state was to run Republican light, with the idea that if you ran as a moderate, you would swing Republican voters and win. And in Texas, that has proven to be a fairy tale. And in fact, that strategy has gotten us farther and farther away from flipping the state. Now, Beto ran as the most progressive candidate that's run statewide that I can ever remember. And he ran also embracing the state's diversity, defending the rights of immigrant families and standing up and alongside the Black Lives Matter movement and against police brutality. And he got closer than anyone has, 2.6 percentage points. Our state is not the state that many people imagine today. We are majority people of color. 1 in the eligible voters by 2022 are under the age of 30. And in 2018, there was a 500% increase in the youth vote. If you ask the diverse voters that are needed to get out and win Texas and flip the state what issues they care about or who their party is, most of them are going to say they don't like Trump, but they're not necessarily going to be excited alone by Democrats. What they care are about real issues like raising the minimum wage. They care about legalizing marijuana. They care about canceling student debt and protecting the rights of immigrant families and remaking our criminal justice system. Those are some of their top issues, and also health care for all, because in Texas, we have the highest uninsured rate in the country. So you have to have a agenda that is as big and bold as our state, I believe, to win as a progressive, which is why I'm running my campaign in that same way and with that same vision.
And oddly enough, I want to start with healthcare and Medicare for all. And when I say oddly, I mean it in the following way: that to be a progressive, you could also make very, very solid economic arguments that would appeal to people that might not traditionally think of themselves as progressives. And I think you make an awesome point that I think is often forgotten in the debate around Medicare for all, that number one, obviously, it's the most efficient and cost-effective way to make sure every American has quality healthcare. But what has always blown my mind is, why isn't there a massive outpouring of small businesses and even big businesses who say, we need Medicare for all because we don't want to just keep dumping money down the drain that should go to all sorts of other things like wages, for example. And instead, we're dumping it into healthcare costs. And you make this excellent point that, in fact, those folks can be allies because they don't want to have to spend all this money on healthcare costs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you look at the Democratic field I'm in, obviously against John Cornyn, I'm the candidate that's the most friendly and the biggest ally of small businesses. But I actually think the most progressive side, people that fight for Medicare for all, are also the most important ally and friend of small businesses. So in the United States, there are 30 million small business owners, and half of them are unable to provide. Currently, less than half of them are unable to provide health insurance to their workers. So that means they're having to compete against huge corporations that can provide better benefits, that are able to negotiate at a much larger scale. You want to talk about an equalizer in our economy that will boost the growth in small businesses and entrepreneurship. I think that policy is Medicare for all. And that's why, one of the reasons why I support it. And, I ran 2 small nonprofits, and, we had like 30 employees. And I remember every year we would have to go through who was going to be our health insurance company, what plan we were going to be able to provide our employees. And I always worked to cover 100% of the premium for our employees. And that was very expensive to do. And still, I offered healthcare to our employees where they would have to, if they went to the doctor, they might out $1,500 or a couple grand if they went to the hospital in the emergency room, because that's what their deductible was. Then you talk about the fact that 60% of Americans have more than $1,000 in savings. The fact that we know that upwards of 2/3 of people declaring bankruptcy is tied to medical debt. This, in the richest nation in the world, it is obviously an incredibly broken system. It's a broken system for the American taxpayer, and it's a broken system for the American people.
And just to underscore the point you just made, you essentially ran twice small businesses. I mean, they were nonprofits, but they are small businesses in the sense that you have to sit there with your pen and paper. That's dating me, I guess. Maybe people use only
and
computers.
An Excel sheet with formulas, budgeting, yes.
And exactly. And you have to realize that in order to cover my employees, in the same way that the small business on the metaphorical Main Street has to do that, you have to figure out how to pay for folks when you know that the most logical way to do that is a national system. So you actually can speak that language to small business owners.
Yeah. And I meet a lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses that are some of the most strong advocates for Medicare for all, because it would help them be able to keep employees, and that people wouldn't have basing where they work based on their health care, or based on their spouse works, and that would allow small businesses to compete with big businesses if we were all paying into the same system that gave everyone the same quality of care. And as a small business owner, what would help me as well is being able, instead of spending time going through really complicated insurance policies that I believe offer sub care at a really high cost, that I would be able to focus on running my business, and my employees would be able to know that anytime they needed a surgery or to go to the doctor, that they would simply have that care, that would be a fundamental and basic right that they had as Americans, as workers and contributors to this country. And I think we would be a much better nation, and we would actually see our economy grow substantially with a system like Medicare for all.
So, what has happened in your campaign that you can point to that you think underscores the nature of the progressive nature of Texas and the kind of support you're gathering for this kind of progressive vision?
I'm really proud that I have the support of people, political legends like Jim Hightower, and then young Latinos that have never been engaged in politics before. They may not even, some of my supporters, be able to tell you who John Cornyn is. If you put him up in the lineup, they wouldn't even know who he was, but that they feel motivated and mobilized and seen by someone running for office for the very first time in their lives. And I'm talking, abuelita, grandmas, in their 60s, people that I've visited in the Valley, which is our border part of the state, to young girls in Dallas, children of immigrants that, were crying when they met me because they felt like they actually had the power in their hands to transform Texas, because no one that has run for office has truly told them that. We assume, especially amongst the Latino population, that they know they are this sleeping giant in Texas. In my experience, many Latinos think we make up 10 or 15% of the state's population because we are consistently under attack, consistently made to feel like a minority in our own state, in our own home, made to feel like outsiders. And what I tell the people that I go reach is that we are under attack and under assault because people fear our power. And they should, because we are determined to come together and change not just Texas, but the entire country with it.
Now, another area where it seems to me that you are potentially not only the advocate for workers, but also against small businesses, the whole community, is the issue of trade. And it is always fascinating to me that Republicans and corporate Democrats all talk about how they are for small businesses. But when you actually look at the trade agreements, and I've looked at this stuff going back to the old NAFTA, not just the remade NAFTA that they've just come to an agreement on, but all those trade agreements essentially are about protecting big business and big corporate interests, especially big finance, big capital, big pharmaceutical companies. And so when you talk about a smart trade policy, how do you view as a senator what you would be pushing for, and where would you make those kinds of changes that would really do better for all people?
Yeah, you can look at something like the North American Free Trade Agreement. I really saw the impacts of a policy that is led purely on what it will do for large scale corporations and not for working people and not for the environment. So I worked for a time period with the United Auto Workers, and saw the long-term impacts that NAFTA had on good manufacturing jobs in our country that were shipped abroad. And then I also worked with immigrant workers and saw how we decimated the agricultural communities of Mexico by flooding the market with cheap corn that then made people have to migrate to the United States to survive economically. It's really clear. Trade can be good, but it also, at the negotiating table, has to be the interests of workers, of unions, and protecting the environment. But trade, where the purpose isn't just about, again, the profit margins of corporations, but making sure that we are supporting good local small businesses, that we are understanding the long-term impacts on workers and families and the environment. That if you look at trade policies and that are being looked at, like by Elizabeth Warren, I think has thought through really smartly how we change our approach to trade. But that's also what I want to do, because I think Texas obviously is one of the states that has the most invested in making sure we have better sound trade policy on both sides of our border and across the globe.
You touched my own heart when you said you had worked for the United Auto Workers because I'm a proud UAW member. I have been for
Oh, great.
over 20 years. But the point you made is really important that these economic issues are very tied to immigration and it's tied to our foreign policy. Trade is at the heart of that, that if you impoverish people on one side of the border, especially in Mexico, and you pointed out what happened under NAFTA to small scale farmers, then if they're thrown off their land, they're looking around and they're saying, what can I do to have my family make a living and make sure they survive? They're going to want to migrate to another country. People don't leave their homes usually because they want to. They flee their homes, they migrate in mass numbers, largely because of economic or political necessity. Sometimes they're political refugees, but oftentimes they're economic refugees. And certainly NAFTA and all these trade agreements prove that.
Yeah, if we look at the years when we saw the largest increase in migration from Mexico to the United States, we're looking at post-NAFTA years. We're looking at the years when we transformed agricultural communities across Mexico with trade policies that sounded really smart for benefiting large-scale corporations in the United States, but we didn't think about the impact for Mexican farmers. Farmers' unions were excluded from being at the negotiating table with NAFTA. If any trade policy that I want us to look at rewriting is going to make sure that there are unions for agricultural workers, for manufacturing workers, environmentalists sitting at that negotiating table, making sure we think through the long-term impacts and the short-term impacts and benefits that we could have, not just for corporations, but for people and our planet.
And as a United States Senator, you will have a big fight, as big a fight within the Democratic Party, as you well know, because unfortunately, many of these trade agreements, especially in the United States Senate, had a lot of support from Democrats, from what I call centrist or corporate Democrats. And they made the argument that somehow this was good for everybody. But of course, it benefited big corporations. And I'm thinking, including the current minority leader, potential majority leader, Chuck Schumer. He's been in favor of many of those trade agreements too. So that's going to be a fight you're going to have in your own caucus. But we'll wait for that day when after you're sworn into office. I do want you to put on your hat as the Workers' Defense Project person, the organization that you co-founded. And you mentioned it on your website. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on. First of all, that we need to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And you also added we have to ensure that it is tied to inflation. And I want to just play a little bit of a counterpoint to that, that to me, tying the minimum wage, even if it gets to $15 an hour to inflation, is not good enough. Because if you look right now, inflation is quite low, but people still can't pay their bills because housing is going up, food costs are going up. So I would argue that just tying it to inflation is not good enough. What's your thought about that?
The minimum wage, when we talk about making it $15 an hour, we've been talking about that for several years. In Texas, our minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. We need to raise the minimum wage, but it has to be a living wage. And it can't be based on the political will or desires of people seeking elected office or corporations. It has to be based on the needs of the American people. And there are different ways to explore how we do that and how we get to that figure. But I know that I'm proud that Democrats are finally talking about how we have a living wage instead of just a minimum wage. The fact, again, that 60% of Americans don't have more than $1,000 in savings. What I think Democrats failed to understand, some Democrats, is the deep economic harm and pain the majority of Americans experience and live every single day across this country. And raising the minimum wage is just the tip of the iceberg. We have to talk about how we build a stronger labor movement, to have unions that protect the interests of middle class and working class families, about how we address runaway inequality, about how we build a tax system that is actually fair and in the best interest of Americans and our country, instead of in the interest of just a few billionaires that currently run our political system and economy that has built a very weak economy that is not benefiting the majority of Americans.
And you're absolutely right. The minimum wage is just the tip of the iceberg because actually, the minimum wage, if you look at productivity over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, should actually be above $20 an hour. But what you did, I think, quite well is underscored the point about unionization because really, and I know you know this as coming from the Workers' Defense Project, really only having a union provides a real living wage because, as we know, looking at lots of communities around the country, whether you go to coal mining communities or steel workers or public employees, those are the folks that are getting what we could consider a living wage with benefits, health care coverage, and so on, right?
That's right. And that's also why I support Medicare for all, because I think it's a big equalizer. It helps Americans focus on increasing their quality of life. When I go to Washington, I really want us to start talking about how we measure how well our economy is doing, not just based on how well big corporations are doing, but by how well ordinary people are doing. How much does the average American have in savings? How much do they have in their retirement account? How much time, free time, do they have to spend with their families and children? That is the kind of economy that I care about, is an economy where people have a strong social safety net, where they are able to support their families and communities. They're not having to work multiple jobs or be working for 60 or 80 hours in one job. The truth is, too, we work so many hours, especially in Texas. We work more hours than most people in other states, but you sure wouldn't know it by looking inside our pocketbooks, because the average Texan makes under $47,000 a year.